Order. Bambos Charalambos to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Desmond, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered UN International Day of Education. Tomorrow, Friday the 24th of January, we mark United Nations International Day of Education. And as we do so, we're reminded of the transformative power of education. It is the cornerstone upon which societies are built, economies are strengthened, and individuals are empowered. Education is not merely a privilege, it is a fundamental human right. Article 28 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child enshrines this right. Yet, as we reflect on our global commitments, particularly Sustainable Development Goal 4, SDG 4, which aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, we must confront the stark reality that progress has been uneven and significant challenges remain if we are to reach SDG 4 targets. Looking at the progress of some of the SDG 4 targets, I will focus first on Target 4.1, which aims to ensure that by 2030, all girls and boys complete free, equitable and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. Since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, strides have been made in expanding access to education. Enrolment rates in primary education have increased globally. According to UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report 2024, 110 million more children and youth have entered school since SDG 4 was adopted in 2015, and there is a growing recognition of the importance of quality education, with 40 million more young people completing secondary education today than in 2015. However, these achievements mask deep disparities. According to UNESCO, there are approximately 251 million children and youth still out of school worldwide, which means that since 2015, the out-of-school population has only reduced by 1%. 33% of out-of-school children and youth are from low-income countries, in contrast to only 3% from high-income countries, and over half of all of the out-of-school children and youth are in sub-Saharan Africa. We've also seen the terrible impact of policies of the Taliban in Afghanistan, depriving girls of their right to education. Urgent action needs to be taken by the international community to ensure that these regional disparities are urgently addressed if we are to meet this SDG 4.1 target. Crises such as conflicts, natural disasters and public health emergencies pose formidable barriers to education. In 2016, 75 million children did not have access to quality education due to forced displacement, humanitarian crises and climate change events. 9 years later, that figure has trebled to 224 million. Even those who do have access to school are not learning the basics, with over half of these children, 127 million, not meeting the minimum standards of literacy and numeracy. The regression to SDG 4 Target 5, eliminating all discrimination in education, including for children in vulnerable education settings, and SDG 4 Target 6, ensuring all youths achieve a minimum standard of literacy and numeracy, is deeply worrying, with UNICEF reporting that 7% of children in low and middle income countries are unable to read a simple story by the age of 10. The root cause of these crises, causing disruption to education, need to be tackled by the international community. UNICEF estimates that climate change alone disrupts the education of nearly 40 million children every year. In countries affected by emergencies, children lose access to safe drinking water, healthcare, and food alongside their education. Schools, which should be sanctuaries of learning, are often targets of attacks. Between 2015 and 2019, attacks on education were reported in 93 countries. More recently, in Gaza, for instance, ongoing conflicts have devastated educational infrastructure, leaving over 1 million children in Gaza in dire need of educational support. In Sudan, over 17 million children are not in education, with schools often being used to house displaced children. In the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, over 1.3 million children are out of school due to an escalation of violence, with children also facing risks of being killed, maimed, abducted, abandoned, and recruited into armed groups. Closer to home, the impact of the war in Ukraine has also had a devastating effect on children's education. Organisations like Education Cannot Wait have been instrumental in addressing these challenges. As the global fund dedicated to education in emergencies, Education Cannot Wait works to ensure that children in crisis settings receive uninterrupted education. Their multi-year resilience programme and the first emergency responses have reached millions of children worldwide. Adequate financing is pivotal to achieving SDG 4, yet education often receives less than 3% of humanitarian aid. According to research by UNICEF, all children-focused overseas development aid fell by 56% from 2016 to 2022. In the UK, that figure fell from 11% to a shocking 4% over the same period. The International Parliamentary Network for Education estimate that the annual financing gap for achieving SDG 4 is 100 billion. The funding gap is exacerbated by debt burdens owed by low and middle income countries. In some cases, the interest owed to private creditors is often more than those countries' entire education budgets. Christian Aid, in their report Between Life and Debt, found that 25 African countries spend more on repaying debt than they do on their entire education budget, including in Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Malawi. Unless there are international structural changes to tackle unsustainable debt, then education will never get fixed in low-income countries, and this will hamper efforts to provide quality education, particularly in low-income countries and crisis-affected regions. Education is one of the most underfunded areas of humanitarian law and only receives approximately 3% of international humanitarian funding, and this is clearly not enough. One of the central tenets of achieving SDG 4 is teachers. There is a global shortage of teachers, with the National Education Union estimating that roughly 44 million additional teachers will be required, 15 million of those in sub-Saharan Africa, in order to meet Sustainable Development's goals for education. In order to achieve this ambition, a new global teacher strategy is needed to train, recruit, and retain qualified teachers in the global south. In many low-income countries, there are huge pressures on teachers, including with regards to working conditions, class sizes, and equipment. Teachers are also often the victims of attacks, and in some instances, teachers are denied regular pay. The UN has recognised this as an important issue, especially in low-income countries where there is a fragile economy. A key recommendation from the UN high-level panel on the teaching profession was the creation of a global fund for teachers' salaries so that children can continue to receive education during crises. I have a number of questions for the Minister before I conclude. First question is in relation to international education aid. I'd like to ask the Minister whether she can advise whether the government will bolster its financial contributions to global education initiatives, ensuring that funds directed towards the most marginalised and crisis-affected children. This includes supporting organisations like Education Cannot Wait and UNICEF, which are on the front lines of delivering education in emergencies. Considering breaking down barriers to opportunity was one of the Labour Party's key missions, and I'd like to ask the Minister to confirm whether that, as funding for education aligns with this mission, that education will receive the priority it deserves. I'd also like to ask the Minister about advocacy for safe schools. As I referred to earlier, a significant factor to children not receiving education is conflict. So I'd like to ask the Minister if she can advise me if the government will champion the protection of educational institutions in conflict zones. By supporting the Safe Schools Declaration and advocating for the adherence to international humanitarian law, we can work towards ending attacks on education. As I mentioned earlier, teachers are the backbone of education systems. Providing them with adequate training, resource and support, especially in emergency contexts, is crucial to ensuring that they are paid for the work they do in very difficult circumstances. And so I'd like to ask the Minister if she could tell me if the government are supportive of the idea of a creation of a global fund for teachers' salaries to help pay for teachers in conflict areas. Finally, on the issue of the promotion of inclusive education, children with disabilities are doubly disadvantaged in receiving education in crises. So I'd like to ask the Minister whether she can advise whether the government will be supporting programmes that target providing education for children with disabilities in crises.
On that point, would you give way?
I give way to my friend.
Thanks to my honourable friend for giving way, and thank you to him for calling this debate, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Desmond. On that point, one of the key barriers for all children, but particularly children with disabilities, is inadequate access to water and sanitation. I believe it's 200 million children don't have a toilet at all at school, and that's 50% of schools in sub-Saharan Africa. So does he agree when we're looking at these issues, it's also important to look at the other Sustainable Development Goals, including Goal 6 on water and sanitation, to ensure efforts are joined up?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. SDG 4 should not be seen in isolation. There are a number of SDG goals that we need to target to make sure that children do receive the education they need, and water and sanitation is quite clearly one of the top ones that we need to do. So I thank my honourable friend for making such an excellent point. Sir Desmond, in conclusion, I'll conclude by saying that education is a beacon of hope in the darkest times. It's the key to breaking cycles of poverty, fostering peace and building resilient societies. And as we mark UN International Day of Education, let us reaffirm our commitment to ensuring that every child, regardless of their circumstances, has access to quality education. The challenges are immense, but with collective will and concerted action, we can turn the tide. The UK has both the responsibility and the capacity to lead in this endeavour, so let us seize the moment to make a lasting difference in the lives of millions of children worldwide. Thank you, Sir Desmond.
The question is that this House has considered the International Day of Education. Richard Ford.
Mr. Desmond, and it is an honour to serve under your chairship. And I'm also very grateful to the honourable member for Southgate and Wood Green for securing this debate. I wanted to start out by saying that education is what we think of when we want to invest in the future. And so much of the work that we discuss in Parliament is about conflict and is about aid and is about the present. But education is that investment in the future. So as we mark the United Nations International Day of Education tomorrow, I wanted to think about a case study, and I'm going to turn to Sudan as that case study. The United Nations has warned that over 19 million school-aged children lack access to education in Sudan. And just to put that into context, we have about 14 million children in the UK, most of whom are receiving some sort of education, most of whom are in school. So the 19 million out of school and not receiving education in Sudan makes this one of the worst education crises in the world. Schools there have been destroyed, teachers have fled, classrooms have become shelters for displaced families. And according to UNICEF, 171 schools are now being used as emergency shelters. The conflict has also brought on that concept, that awful concept of the child soldier, and child recruitment into armed groups is rife. An entire generation is growing up without education. War in Sudan, like many other global conflicts, is going to have some lasting consequences. And these ongoing attacks, some of them on children, persist as warring factions violate one of the most basic principles of the law of armed conflict, that of protecting children. With schools often targeted or repurposed, learning is being disrupted not just for those who are child soldiers or involved as combatants, but for others as well. And so the loss of education is going to have profound long-term repercussions, including for those individuals, reduced income, poorer health outcomes, and limited opportunities. And for the society in Sudan as a whole, it will lead to cycles of poverty and instability in the future. According to the United Nations, the education crisis in Sudan is, quote, the worst education crisis in the world. When schools close, children become vulnerable to various risks, including exploitation, forced recruitment, abuse. The psychological toll leaves many children unable to resume their normal schooling, even when schools reopen. And as of December 2024, over 14.8 million people have been displaced in Sudan, 11.5 million of those internally displaced. So this is the largest displacement crisis in the world, and over 53% of those displaced individuals are children. With school buildings converted into shelters, children have now gone 22 months without education. The educational facilities themselves have been attacked. They've been destroyed, looted, or occupied. And children who once attended school every day are instead working in markets, polishing shoes, and performing manual labour to survive. This forced separation from the school and from their fellow school pupils is making it increasingly unlikely that they'll return to school even when the conflict abates in the future. And the chance that these children who are exposed to violence go on then later to perpetrate violence themselves is greater, and even if they don't do that, they are likely to underachieve or drop out. I want to focus on the work of a small charity because I just want to also have a note of optimism in this otherwise very pessimistic window on what's going on in Sudan. The Windle Trust, or Windle Trust International, has operated in Sudan since 1999. And it provides educational opportunities for refugees and IDPs. For internally displaced people. Before the current war, the organisation ran 8 schools in Khartoum and 2 for Ethiopian refugees, and it supported 426 refugees from Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Yemen, Somalia, and Syria. And they partnered with 42 universities to offer higher education scholarships. They're providing 558 university scholarships, supporting more than 68,000 girls to stay in school, and they had trained over 9,000 teachers, nearly 9,500 teachers. But the effect of the war on Windle Trust International is that they've had their offices in Khartoum looted, and staff were scattered, operational funding was curtailed, and this has caused the closure of programmes and the ending of staff contracts. Nonetheless, they're still able to operate a presence in Blue Nile State, where a smaller field office supports Ethiopian refugees in a camp which hosts approximately 12,000 people, 58% of whom are of school age. It does receive WTI, or Windle Trust International, does receive some funding from UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, but that's barely enough to cover 2 schools, teachers' salaries, uniforms, education materials, and the training. And so it's a pretty dire circumstance for a small NGO operating in country. The Sudanese government at federal and state levels can no longer adequately sustain its own education system. Teachers have gone unpaid for 22 months. Reports indicate that 10,000 children have been recruited into armed groups. Education in conflict zones is their way out. And beyond imparting academic schools, schools can provide routine, security, and hope. Where education is withheld, children suffer harm, lose future opportunities, and lose the recovery prospects of the country as a whole. If Sudan fails to educate a generation of its children, its path towards development and ultimately a growing economy will become increasingly difficult. And I want to close by thinking a little bit about financial support for organisations operating in country and indeed education that is provided through what was the Department for International Development, now the FCDO. Of course, we've had a cut in the development budget in the UK from 0.7 to 0.5% in the last few years, and that is currently being exacerbated by the use of official development assistance funding in the UK. The UK's Independent Commission for Aid Impact, or ICI, has oversight of official development assistance funding, and it has pointed to how £4 billion of development funding is being spent on here in the UK on, for example, asylum hotels, when it could go so much further if it was spent in country on such things as education. The purchasing power that we would have by spending overseas as opposed to in the UK is so much greater. Other countries don't do things this way. Sweden limits its in-donor refugee costs to a maximum of 8% of its aid budget. Austria and Luxembourg declare no asylum costs as official development assistance. This is a choice that the government is making right now. To conclude, in any comprehensive response to Sudan's crisis, education must be prioritised as long-term development, not just the conflict aid that we think of, such as food, shelter and healthcare. And small NGOs like Windle Trust International are doing their very best to facilitate that, but they could do so much more if the West and UK government, for example, was to step up and support. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, can I congratulate the honourable gentleman for Southgate and Wood Green for setting the scene, and by having this debate, he's all given us a chance to be here and participate as well. So, pleasure to serve under your chairship, Sir Desmond. I'm not quite sure. I think this might be your first time chairing in Westminster Hall. If it is, I wish you well for the future. If it isn't, my apologies for not being here whenever you were here before. I'm not quite sure how that could happen, but that's by the way. Just to say that it is a pleasure to speak in this, and it's a massive issue, and I want to, if I can, indeed I hope to do so, say this: that education is the cornerstone of our society, a vital tool that empowers individuals, strengthens communities, and as we mark International Day of Education, I would wish to focus on my contribution. It probably won't come as a surprise to honourable members who are here, the role of freedom of religion or belief and the policies that we have implemented. Just to give a quick example of Northern Ireland, but I want to focus on what we do in Northern Ireland and how it affects education in other parts of the world. It's all done basically through the mission societies, the mission groups, the churches in my constituency of Strangford. And also, of course, in Northern Ireland, we promote equitable access to education and foster community well-being globally, because we believe that's what we should be doing. Education is not merely the transmission of knowledge; it is also very much so, and the Minister will know this in particular, and as others will be aware of. It is the foundation of human dignity and freedom, and therefore education is so vitally important. The honourable gentleman who spoke before me, his contribution, all the contributions, by the way, will be excellent. I've never any doubt about that. But he outlined some of the countries across the world where the problems are, and I want to probably focus upon two when I get the chance. Around the world, we see how education serves as a cornerstone of development. It fosters equality, creates opportunity for millions, and that's the purpose of education. As a grandfather, I suppose I'm now watching my two youngest grandchildren, Freya, who's 4, and Ezra, who's 2.5, just learning the nursery classes, the education, and their thirst for knowledge. Now, that's just me in my house about 3 days a week whenever I'm home, but I see through them what others across the world would wish to achieve as well, and that's why it's important. However, in some regions, children are deprived of their right to education simply because of their religious identity or indeed their belief. Denying education based on these grounds, I believe, violates not just human rights, but the very principles of humanity and fairness. On this International Day of Education, I believe we have an opportunity in this debate today to reaffirm our commitment to ensuring that every child irrespective of the religion, of their ethnicity, of their gender, has access to quality education. And in doing so, through this debate, I believe we also champion freedom of religion or belief, standing against all forms of discrimination that threaten the right to learn. A very basic request, but a really priority which we all focus on. In Northern Ireland, we're very proud very of our charitable giving, the highest per capita in the whole of the United Kingdom, and I believe compared to the rest of the world, for a population of 1.9 million, it's probably the highest anywhere. This is deeply rooted, I believe, in our Christian faith and reflects the values of compassion and stewardship as well. The Bible's very clear. 1/10 of your earnings should go to the Lord's work, and that's a reminder. And I'm not better than anybody else, and I never will be, and never try to be. But I try to adhere to that rule, a biblical rule, myself personally, as many others do. Much of this generosity is directed towards supporting children and young people in health and education, both locally and also then globally. Faith-based charities and local churches play an instrumental role in this, supporting feeding and educational programmes worldwide. These initiatives bring hope to some of the most vulnerable communities, offering not just education, but nourishment and safety and the promise of a better tomorrow. Because when you're educating and every year one of the churches in my town, it's the Elim Church, they have a mission. They are in Swaziland, in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, and every year there's a Swaziland choir comes over. Every one of them children have been affected by AIDS, and in particular through their parents in most cases, and unfortunately in the womb. But they have a most incredible talent for singing. I know I have it whenever I sing, the rain comes on. But the fact of the matter is, whenever they sing, it does, I believe, transport you in a way. The point I'm making is that's one of the charities that they help. They help them young children with AIDS who probably without these missions, Sir Desmond, wouldn't have a hope of education or health or a future at all. So they do those things. And it's not the only church that does it. There's many other churches. I'm very blessed in my constituency at Strangford to have many churches who are all committed to the very same thing. And I understand that the work that they do in Sudan and Congo, as two examples, in South Africa as well, and indeed in Nigeria. I'm going to mention it specifically because I've had a chance to visit Nigeria. However, when mentioning the gaps filled internationally by charitable giving, I cannot but mention the disparity, and I just make this comment, it's not for the Minister to respond to, the per capita funding for Northern Irish students compared to other UK students, just as a by the way, not for any comment from the Minister whatsoever. FORB is a universal human right that guarantees individuals the freedom to have, adopt, change, or leave a religion or belief, as well as to manifest it without coercion. In other words, you can practice your freedom in the way that you so wish to do, whether you be a Christian, whether you be another religion, or whether you don't have any religion at all, because that's what I believe in. This freedom is closely intertwined with education. Children and young people must be free from discrimination based on their religion or belief, or that of their parents. Faith-based organisations often lead the way in advocating for these principles, ensuring access to education for marginalised and for vulnerable communities worldwide. The Honourable Gentleman reminded me when he mentioned Sudan and Congo, and I think of Nigeria, where I was, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, now time goes so quick. But I remember meeting some of the displaced Christians from the northeast state of Nigeria, from the Central Plateau, unfortunately, where it's moving down. Also, some of the Muslims who were displaced as well. And education, even in those displaced camps, was still important. And okay, who did that? Well, it was mostly government were helping, but it was mostly the charitable groups. It was the NGOs. It was the people who, outside of government policy or strategy, were actually doing it. And the volunteers were teaching, very rudimentary teaching, but they were teaching them education. And how vital that was to have that in place. And I think as well of the kidnapping of whole schools of young girls in Nigeria, kidnapped by Boko Haram and by Daesh, and some of them have never been freed. And unfortunately, as so often happens at an early age, they're kidnapped and abused by their captors, and end up with children as well. I think of one person who was kidnapped I can't remember just how many years ago. I was mentioning the year, but I think it could well be 10 years ago now. But as Leah Sharby, you call her, she has never been returned to her parents, to her family. She's a mother, she has 2 children, that's the information coming out. But even today, now a lady and not a school pupil, teenager anymore, we think of her in captivity. And we think of all those young girls who perhaps keen and eager, Sir Desmond, to be reunited with their families once again. So when it comes to what's happening in Sudan, John was right to mention it, but the same thing is happening, unfortunately, across other parts of the world. I think of Pakistan. I've had been fortunate to attend to visit Pakistan on 2 occasions. Young children, educationally, and when you see the displaced people, the Christians, they live in rudimentary housing. But I always remember the first visit that I had, where we found these 2 or 3 teachers, volunteer teachers that were teaching the young children of all ages, from 4 to 16, in a massive one class, and they were all getting the education that was coming through. Again, education is so important to give them opportunity, to give them chance, to give them hope. I think is also important. Now, Pakistan sets aside 5 to 6% of the jobs for Christians, but Christians, and young Christians in particular, I mentioned this because they're people I was speaking to, those job opportunities can only come if you have the education, if you have the opportunity. If you want to become a nurse, you want to become a doctor, you want to become a teacher, you want to move on. The last time we were there, we met the Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church in Pakistan, and they outlined what they were doing with their school children to give them opportunity. And it gave me heart personally, Sir Desmond, to hear of what those things were happening in Pakistan. But there are many who fall outside of that. So again, education is so important. We need to do a whole lot to make that happen. And it's about opportunity, it's about equality, it's about human rights, it's about having the same chance to go for a job as somebody else who just happens to be a Muslim or happens to be a Hindu or whatever. Religion's not important. It's your ability to do the job, and the opportunity should be there for you as well. Research consistently shows that high-quality early education has long-term benefits, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Expanding access to early education programmes and ensuring that they are adequately funded should be a priority. I'm incredibly pleased to see the Minister in her place. She knows that, because I think the Minister very ably grasps what their requests are, and does her darnest to make sure that our questions are answered. So I look forward to her answers. I look forward very much to the Shadow Minister as well in their place. We've fought many debates together. We've been on the same side many times. We'll be on the same side today as well. And I look forward to the Honourable Lady's contribution. By doing so, we not only support individual children, but also strengthen families and communities, creating a ripple effect of opportunity and hope, which is so important. And we do this at home, and we also must do that abroad. I think of, again, an example back home of what we try to do in education. It's not a global issue. It's in my constituency, but it's still part of education. One of the most effective residents' association in my constituency of Strangford is the Scrabble Residents Group. Again, I mentioned because they run projects that build confidence among young men who are. In Northern Ireland, we have a large number of people who are young Protestant males who have not achieved educational standards to get them a job, to give them an opportunity, to give them hope as well. But they do that. They understand their potential, break their cycles of unemployment. Success stories for them, for young people who didn't do well in education back in Northern Ireland, as HGV driving, factories and farming. Their pride in their achievements is inspiring and demonstrates the value of grassroots initiatives. That is replicated, Sir Desmond, by the church groups in my constituency of Strangford, in particular in the towns of Newton Ard, but right across the whole of the area. So when we look at some of the things that we do, engage for programme and nurture units, them community-led projects are then used by the the church groups, by the missions, by the NGOs, by those who have a particular interest and passion for what happens in Africa and across the world. I think of those missionary groups who are committed to the provision of jobs for life education. The one that even missions is one example. They just don't educate them at a primary school level. They educate them the whole way through, and they get them to where they can have jobs. And that's really where we need to be. Global education cannot today will lead to jobs tomorrow. And the ambitions of those young people, of that Swaziland choir, to be a teacher, to be a doctor, to be a nurse, to have my own business, isn't that all start with education? And that's where we are. So it's a really a pleasure to be here and understand. You almost, if you take a step back, Sir Desmond, you're almost be amazed, be impressed by what education does and what it can do for the future. I conclude with this. Education is not just a pathway to personal achievement, it's a collective endeavour that shapes our society and indeed our future. And by emphasising the role of faith, upholding freedom of religious belief and ensuring equitable policies, we can build a world where every child, regardless of their circumstances, has the opportunity to thrive. Now that's worth fighting for.
Monica Harding.
Thank you, Chair, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And I'd like to thank the member for Southgate and Wood Green for bringing this debate to us today. And as he has pointed out, quality education is not just an important sustainable development goal in itself. It's also integral to the achievement of all SDGs. It enhances individual productivity, it fosters economic growth. It builds resilient communities in fragile states, develops skills for quality work opportunities, challenges harmful discriminatory values and promotes peace, the rule of law and respect for human rights. Every child has a right to a quality education, no matter who they are or where they live. Yet there are over 250 million children who are out of school worldwide, with marginalised groups such as girls, children with disabilities and those from remote or conflict areas bearing the brunt of this exclusion. For example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban have created the world's most egregious women's rights crisis, with restrictions impacting 1 million girls and women's access to secondary school and higher education. The provision of inclusive, equitable education is worryingly fragile, in far more states than I have time to mention in this very short time, like in Nigeria, which accounts for 20% of all out-of-school children in sub-Saharan Africa, and Pakistan, where at the existing rate it would take the country at least 50 years to enrol all girls in school. And in Gaza, a September UNRWA report suggests children and young people's education will be set back by 5 years, risking a lost generation of permanently traumatised Palestinian youth. With a ceasefire now in place, it is vital that the UK government scales up its spending for education in its humanitarian response, given satellite images verify over 90% of schools in Gaza have been damaged, with no universities still in place. As my honourable friend from Honiton and Sidmouth pointed out, the lack of education in conflict zones or post-conflict zones puts children at further risks. These are traumatised children. Our own experience here in the UK during the pandemic shows how a school fulfills so much more than an academic responsibility, but are the front line for a child's well-being and development. The UK has been proud to stand as one of the largest donors to global education, has consistently advocated for the transformative impact of education. But UK funding for global education has steadily declined over the past decade, dropping from 13.5% in bilateral ODA in 2013 to just 3.5% in 2023. Of course, this is in part a result of the ODA budget being cut from 0.7 to 0.5% of GNI, but education has faced much sharper cuts than other sectors, with cuts of 40% compared to the average 25% decrease for other sectors. I'd be grateful if the Minister could outline what steps the Department intends to take to remedy this disproportionate budget cut to global education in the next financial year. I note too that this government has commissioned 3 reviews into its international development policy, so I would be grateful to hear from the Minister when these outcomes of these reviews will be published and what commitments will be made on education for the upcoming financial year, including for girls' education. So in conclusion, as we commemorate the International Day of Education, let us be reminded that by investing in inclusive and equitable quality education, we're not only fulfilling a fundamental human right, but also paving the way for a more prosperous, just and sustainable future for us all.
The Liberal Democrat spokesman, James McCleary.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I'd like to echo the comments of others and add my thanks to the Honourable Member for Southgate and Wood Green for bringing forward this very valuable debate today. Tomorrow, on the United Nations International Day of Education, we must turn our attention to a fundamental truth. Education is the foundation of opportunity, equality and progress. This year's theme couldn't be more relevant as we grapple with the rapid changes reshaping our world. Sustainable Development Goal 4 is a bold commitment to deliver quality education for all. Yet with just 5 years left until 2030, we're worryingly off track. Across the globe, nearly half of primary schools can't cater for children with disabilities, and over 20% lack basic sanitation for girls. These are stark reminders that millions of young people are being denied their right to learn. Conflict has only made matters worse. In Ukraine, over 7,000 schools are out of action, and millions of children have seen their education upended. And it's not just Ukraine. As my friend, the Honourable Member for Honiton and Sidmouth outlined, Sudan has suffered greatly, as have other countries, Syria and Gaza. Education is often a casualty of war, and the future of too many children hangs in the balance right now. Closer to home, while there have been some improvements in global rankings, our own education system faces significant challenges. Teacher shortages, overstretched SEND funding and falling PISA scores paint a picture of a system that's struggling to meet the needs of today's pupils. Meanwhile, on the international stage, the UK government's decision to slash bilateral aid for education from 757 million in 2017 to just 336 million last year is deeply shameful. And I will look forward to hearing the Minister's comments on what the government is aiming to do to address these massive cutbacks that have affected global education so much. Education is not just about classrooms and textbooks. It's a catalyst for progress, prosperity and peace. For the Liberal Democrats, this is non-negotiable. We'd reverse the aid cuts, commit 15% of our development budget to education and prioritise support for women and girls. We'd also create a UK Sustainable Development Goal czar to ensure real accountability for delivering SDG 4 both at home and abroad. Let's not forget, education transforms lives. It is the great leveller, opening doors to opportunity and hope. As we mark this day, let's commit to ensuring that every child, wherever they are, has the chance to learn and thrive. Thank you.
Yeah.
Shadow Minister Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Sir Desmond, and it's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And let me start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Southgate and Wood Green for bringing forward this debate today. I know he's also the chair of the APPG for Global Education too. And I'm grateful to members for their contributions. Not least, I have to single out the Honourable Member for Strangford, who, as always, demonstrates when it comes to international development matters his vast knowledge and his understanding. As we mark the UN International Day of Education, I'm reminded of the inextricable link between education and international development. We see this reflected in UN Sustainable Development Goal number 4 and the work that we did in government to expand access to education, particularly for women and girls worldwide. Remarkable progress has been made, but we must also remember the challenges that we face around the world today. There is, of course, much more to do, but we are clear that education is one of the best investments that we can make. Since 2015, we supported 19.8 million children, including over 10 million girls, to gain a decent education. We know that girls' education, alongside all of its intrinsic benefits, leads to safer and more prosperous societies, more effective peace building, gender equality and greater resilience against climate change. In 2023, we launched the International Women and Girls Strategy, which set the approach for the rest of the decade by placing women and girls at the heart of the FCDO's work. To be clear, though, Sir Desmond, this isn't to say that we value boys' education any less highly. In fact, on the contrary, it's only by involving boys and men can we address harmful gender stereotypes and break down the barriers that so often hold women and girls back. Now, I've asked the government before about their plans to build on our work on the Women and Girls strategy. And so today, I would appreciate a clear reassurance from the Minister that she has no plans to tinker with the strategy as it is, and that she will simply get on with what we started, rather than risk the hard-won progress that has been achieved. As the Minister knows, making progress in education is only possible if we work with the right partners. And that's why in government we were top bilateral donors to the multilateral education funds, the Global Partnership for Education, or GPE, and Education Cannot Wait, as ECW. And together, these organisations reach over 80 countries worldwide, including in the most conflict-affected areas. GPE reports that they have reached 253 million children in partner countries since 2022. And as the Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable, Lady, the Minister for International Development said recently, ECW, the Global Fund for Education in Emergencies, recruited or financially supported 23,449 teachers in 2022-23 alone. So today I'd like to ask the Minister what her plans are for supporting global education funds such as GPE and ECW, and what representations is she making to the Treasury ahead of the spending review. Education, Sir Desmond, was embedded in our international development work in government. This was reflected in the 3 E's of the Women and Girls strategy: educating girls, empowering women and girls and championing their health and rights, and ending gender-based violence. These priority themes represent the areas where the challenges are most acute, but the potential gains are greatest, and where the UK is best placed to add value and catalyse progress. Like the Women and Girls strategy, our 2023 International Development White Paper is a roadmap to 2030. In the White Paper, we identified UK higher education and research as important partnerships in delivering development. Through direct research, international education and student links and scholarships, our education, science and research institutions are part of how the UK builds capacity with development partners. Both of the 2 malaria vaccines to be recommended by the World Health Organization drew on the UK's science and health expertise. Now, yesterday, the 22nd of January, marked exactly 1 year since the rollout of the first malaria vaccine, which has now reached children in over 17 countries. The first, Mosquirix, was developed by GSK, a British company, and the second, R21, at the Jenner Institute at Oxford University. Now, given this impactful legacy from our time in government, can I ask the Minister how she plans to build on that support for our education and research sectors? I'm sure that she understands that continuing to leverage homegrown excellence will be crucial in achieving our development objectives. And I'd like now just to turn briefly to the development review. I know the Minister has received extensive evidence from Baroness Shafiq in the other place, who has now submitted the independent review to her and the Foreign Secretary. I understand they're currently considering the findings, and we eagerly wait to hear their plans to publish them. So today, can I give the Minister the opportunity to commit that she will engage with members across this House and publish the findings in full? I'd also like to invite her to share with us whether the review has considered education, as she will recognise the interest colleagues rightly have in this area. But before I conclude, I'd like to touch on 2 contexts which are deeply concerning. Firstly, in Afghanistan, an estimated 3.7 million children are out of school. 60% of them are girls. The Taliban blocked women and girls from pursuing secondary and higher education over the age of 12, and most recently suspended access to medical education following the closure of many other educational routes. So can I ask the Minister to update us on the bilateral and multilateral discussions she is having to mobilise action on women and girls' education in Afghanistan? And secondly, I'd like to mention Myanmar, because we're very concerned that 4 million children are currently out of school due to the humanitarian situation. Now, I understand the government are taking a highly localised approach to aid delivery in Myanmar, and I appreciate the Minister won't be able to speak necessarily in detail about local partners in order to protect their safety. However, I would be grateful if she could update us on some of the work she is doing to help with access to education in Myanmar. And so, Sir Desmond, to conclude, quality education is an integral part of international development. And as we mark UN International Day of Education, let's celebrate our successes while remaining vigilant to the challenges that we face today. The UK has a key role to play in working with partners and leveraging homegrown expertise to support education worldwide, alongside our other international development objectives.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Sir Desmond, and it's a real pleasure to serve in this debate with you in the chair. And of course, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Southgate and Wood Green, for securing this very important debate on the eve of the International Day for Education. And I'm so grateful to all of the honourable members for the really important points that you've raised during the relatively short debate that we've had. I think we've heard some really illuminating speeches, and I'm going to do my best, Sir Desmond, to respond to the many important points that have been raised. I think, as many have said, we are aware that while there have been many improvements, certainly in the absolute numbers of children who are able to access education, we know that education overall is in crisis. Globally, some 250 million children are not in school and counting. And as we've heard, poverty, gender, disability and a lack of schools or teachers, particularly trained teachers, all have a part to play in this. Climate crisis and conflict are now disrupting the education of over 220 million children every single year and counting. And last year alone, extreme weather events meant that children in low-income countries missed out on 18 days of school. And as I discussed with some young people in South Sudan, the same children who are flooded out of their schools during the rainy season being the ones who are not able to learn because it's too hot during the dry season. That means that in many of these countries, some children are missing up to a whole month of school. And millions of the children who are in school are not learning effectively, Sir Desmond. That includes the 70% of children in school in low and middle income countries who are still unable to read a basic text by the age of 10. Young women and girls, of course, are disproportionately affected by all of this. I was really grateful to the opposition spokesperson for raising this, as she has frequently, that situation for women and girls. And of course, that particularly applies also when it comes to access to higher and further education. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, only 7% of eligible women are enrolled in universities and colleges. That compares to the global average of 42%. And the opposition spokesperson mentioned the role of the UK higher education sector. I was really pleased that she did. I think that's incredibly important in this context to bring in that expertise. We are really seeking to build this, and I met recently with Baroness Smith and other experts to talk about the UK's international education effort. Now, when you consider, Sir Desmond, that every additional year of learning provides a 10% increase in later earnings annually, clearly education's got a key role to play in tackling poverty and supporting resilient long-term growth. And the Honourable Member for Esher and Walton ably set out how important education is, not just economically, but for so many other things as well: stability, security, healthcare, and other outcomes that we need to see. Of course, she has considerable expertise around this, given her previous roles with the British Council. But we know, of course, that the financing gap for education in low and middle income countries is an estimated $97 billion every year. More than 60% of that gap is finance that would be provided by the governments of those countries. And when we look at the overall contribution of overseas development assistance to education, we see overall it makes up 3% of education budgets. And we do see as was mentioned rightly by my honourable friend, he's really passionate about this issue, that some 3.3 billion people now are living in countries that are spending more on servicing their debt than they are on health or on education that would underpin long-term, resilient, inclusive growth. And all of that, of course, is at a time when populations are on the rise in sub-Saharan Africa. So, in short, we need the kind of massive global effort that so many have said during this debate is necessary so that we can ensure that people are provided with a quality education. Now, over the last 6 months, I've been making the case for action around the world, from South Sudan to the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York, the meetings of the World Bank in Washington, the Climate Summit COP29 in Baku, through to meeting young people themselves who've been championing global education in schools across our country, who came into Parliament. Perhaps some other members met with them as well. They were incredibly powerful advocates. And the UK is determined to work in genuine partnership with like-minded donors, multilateral organisations and countries and communities across the global south so that we address that global learning crisis in a way that's effective and also a way that's efficient. So today, Sir Desmond, I want to highlight 4 areas corresponding to the points that were raised by honourable members. First of all, we're making foundational learning for all a priority. That means using the best available evidence to support reforms and helping governments to provide all children with the building blocks for their future. I saw that for myself when I was in Malawi, how that work, using UK expertise to focus on foundational mathematics, made a huge difference, moving away from rote learning, which so often is not leading to those skills that children need. And of course, this is important not just for numeracy, as I mentioned, and literacy. It's important for social and emotional skills as well, so that we can prepare children and young people to navigate a rapidly changing world. Of course, we also need to target the most marginalised. We're seeking to do that, those living in poverty or conflict, refugees and those caught up in crisis, and of course, girls. And the opposition spokesperson mentioned the Women and Girls strategy. She will know that my approach and the approach of the government is not to say that where there are sensible reforms that have been aimed at by the previous government, that we will put them in a drawer and not enact them. We're determined to make progress speedily. Of course, we need to make sure that the strategy is up to date, but we are not going to be saying that the main tenets of that, especially around education for girls, as we've been talking about now, shouldn't be held to in the future. But we really want to enact them. That's the key thing for us, and to embed long-term progress. Disabled children were rightly mentioned as well by my friend for Southgate and Wood Green. Here I would like to mention, actually, Myanmar. The opposition mentioned this rightly. In fact, I met with some education specialists virtually, obviously, this morning, who are based in Myanmar. She's absolutely right. Given the regime there and how it operates, I can't go into a huge amount of detail about exactly which organisations are involved, but I'm really proud of the fact, Sir Desmond, that the UK is working directly with local communities, with local experts, so that those children, including disabled children, children who've had to have amputations because of landmines and because other problems have befallen them, that they are able to access that education. This really is a case where, as was mentioned by my honourable friend, education isn't just a privilege, it is a right of those children and a right indeed of disabled children. I should also inform the House that in October we announced that the UK is going to be launching a global task force to tackle sexual and physical violence and psychological harm in and around schools. Horrific abuse, both within schools and outside them, devastates lives, and it accounts for about 5% of school dropouts and lower attainment worldwide. And again, my honourable friend rightly raised this. We have to make sure that schools are actually safe. We're determined to advocate for that, and that's in line with the fact that, of course, the UK is a signatory to the Safe Schools Declaration. Grateful to the previous government for signing up to that rightly. And, of course, safety also has to be provided when it comes to freedom of religion and belief. I was really grateful to the honourable member for Strangford for raising that. Thank him very much indeed for his kind words. Of course, he champions always freedom of religion and belief. And it's absolutely right, as he said, that education provides dignity, that a lack of literacy, lack of numeracy, lack of skills disempowers people, stops them from being able to take the choices that they might need for themselves and their families. And he talked about those schoolgirls who've been abducted in Nigeria. I remember when I was talking with schoolgirls in Zambia, those young girls get up at 5:30 in the morning, they clean where they live, young, 13-year-olds, they do all the cooking for the household, they get ready to learn, they learn all day, they're thirsty to learn, they're determined to learn, and we must always ensure that they have the safety that is surely their right, wherever they are in the world. Second, Sir Desmond, we're scaling up finance for education around the world and seeking to make it smarter. We're sharing our trusted research and evidence to encourage philanthropic organisations to collaborate more and maximise our impact. And we're pivoting away from funding education directly towards helping governments improve the way they support the sector for the long term, particularly with partners across the global south. And we're making the most here of UK expertise and our diplomatic reach to champion new ways to champion innovative new ways to mobilise finance. And I would mention here that the UK plays a really important role in developing the International Finance Facility for Education. It provides a 7-fold return on investment. It really is an incredible instrument, exactly the kind of multiplying effect we need to have on the funding that's available. We're calling on others now to join us in backing it. Together we can unlock $1 billion in additional affordable finance for lower and middle income country governments. Third, we are determined to ensure that more children are safe and able to learn, and that includes those, as mentioned by many honourable members, living through conflict and in communities affected by the climate and nature crisis. And as was mentioned, of course, by many already, even with the welcome ceasefire that we've seen between Israel and Hamas, the impacts of that conflict remain devastating for education. 95% of schools in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. So in addition to our funding for the UNRWA core budget, the UK is contributing £2 million to Education Cannot Wait and £5.6 million to the Global Partnership for Education to improve access to education for hundreds of thousands of children across Gaza and the West Bank as they start to rebuild. And I was pleased that the Honourable Member for East and Walton and many others mentioned this. The case of Afghanistan was also rightly mentioned. We have seen the appalling measures adopted by the Taliban, particularly in relation to girls' secondary education, but also when it comes to medical education, so many other areas where women and girls are seeing their rights systematically stripped away in that country. We are determined as the UK Government to play our part, first to ensure that we are supporting the education of girls, that we are ensuring that our funding as the UK is supporting the education of girls, that at least 50% of funding when it comes to education is going to girls. We're determined to ensure that, and also that we are advocating more generally for girls and women in Afghanistan. And in this chamber, Sir Desmond, recently I was pleased to announce that the UK is now one of the countries that's politically supporting the case when it comes to Afghanistan on the basis of the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. In November, we announced £14 million for education programmes in Sudan and for Sudanese refugees, where, as has been mentioned, 17 million children have had no access to education since April 2023. And I was really grateful to the words of the Honourable Member for Honiton and Sidmouth in that regard. We see that in some areas 90% of children are out of formal schooling now in Sudan. He, I know, like the government, has been determined to not just raise the profile of that appalling conflict in Sudan, the worst displacement crisis in the world, but also to advocate for measures that will directly support Sudanese people. He knows that we have doubled the UK's support to Sudan and to Sudanese people who've been displaced. We're using every avenue to push for an end to the hostilities and, of course, to ensure that there is a holding to international humanitarian law, as with other crises. And like him, I would pay tribute to organisations like the Windle Trust, which are so critical for the education of children in Sudan. I have to say I'm very proud that it's based in my constituency as well. It really does impress me that an organisation based in Oxford is having such an impact all around the world. And of course the role of faith-based organisations was rightly mentioned by the Honourable Member for Strangford as well, quite rightly, because we see the huge impact that they so often have for communities all around the world. So thanks to him for mentioning that. The use of schools as shelters, which was mentioned in relation to Sudan, is also, of course, a problem that we've seen in Lebanon when there was the crisis there, and I can inform members that the UK was determined to ensure that we were playing our part for those children who were no longer able to use those schools because they were used as shelters, that they would get the emergency education that they needed. Now, on the issue specifically around funding that were raised by a number of members, my honourable friend asked about funding overall. I can confirm to members that, as well as the support for Education Cannot Wait and for the Global Partnership for Education, we also have a number of bilateral programmes that are delivered as well, which focus on promoting learning. We're currently the top bilateral donor to the Global Partnership for Education and the second largest bilateral donor to Education Cannot Wait, and I had the absolute privilege of being at the AGM for Education Cannot Wait. Of course, Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, being such a strong advocate for Education Cannot Wait and achieving incredible things with it. We are, of course, in the middle of a spending review process, as a number of members mentioned, but their very powerful comments about the importance of education will, of course, be ones that we are determined to bear in mind as we are developing our allocations more broadly and our decisions for that spending review, both in the immediate future and, of course, the longer-term spending review as well. We will update the House and members as soon as is practicably possible. On the issue that was mentioned around the reviews. So yes, there are 3 reviews overall for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, one which is specifically focused on development that's being undertaken by Baroness Minouche Shafiq. It's specifically focused on the capability and capacity of development within the FCDO. That's after many years when there has been a lot of turbulence around the UK's approach to international development, where we've seen in particular a huge amount of financial turbulence. The growth, which was untrammelled in donor refugee costs that we've seen within ODA, did not help there. There was not a consistent approach. We are determined to have a consistent approach for the future, and I hope that members are seeing that in the way that we are facing up to these issues. On the point about teachers that has been mentioned, and the work that's being undertaken by the National Education Union, this is really important work. I would say there, and I'm sure that they're keen to do this, Sir Desmond, it will be very important for that to be linked in with work by Education Cannot Wait and the Global Partnership for Education. Education Cannot Wait provides a lot of support for teachers, including direct financial support and support around recruitment, also psychosocial support when they're operating in dangerous environments as well. And the Global Partnership for Education provides, well, the UK contribution to it has an over-representation of fragile and conflict-affected states within that contribution. So 60% of our funding to GPE is going to fragile and conflict-affected states. So there is a lot of work in this area, and I'm sure that the NEU will be wanting to engage with that, and I'd of course be very happy to discuss it with them if that would be useful to them. And finally, Sir Desmond, we're investing to make education systems more resilient to the climate crisis and better able to help students thrive beyond their school years. Yeah.
Richard Ford.
I'm grateful to the Minister. I wonder if she would agree with the Chair of the International Development Committee, who called the use of official development assistance for hosting asylum seekers in hotels a spectacular own goal.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. Well, of course, I have enormous respect for the Chair of the International Development Committee. I've had a lot of discussions with her and other members of the committee on this subject. The decision to count in-donor refugee costs within the overall category of overseas development assistance is, of course, one that is a statistical decision that has been taken by the OECD. Now, different countries have had far lower levels of their overseas development assistance going into these in-donor refugee costs. They've not seen the untrammelled increases that we saw under previous governments. As I said, the current UK government is determined to have a longer-term approach to this and to get those costs down. And in fact, we have been doing so. That's been reflected in the decision that was taken by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury around an increase in the yearly ODA that was just after the turn of the year. Part of that was from that reduction in donor refugee costs, and of course is a priority for the Home Secretary and indeed for the whole government to be ensuring that we are dealing with those issues. So I'm grateful to him for raising that point. As I mentioned, Sir Desmond, we are investing to make systems for education more resilient. At COP28 in Dubai, the UK helped to launch a new global declaration on the common agenda for education and climate change, through which 90 countries have now committed to action on climate that helps protect education. And ahead of COP30 in Brazil this year, we're working with our partners to prioritise the role of education in combating the climate and nature crises and to secure further action to protect children, including when they're learning, from extreme weather. And I would mention in my regard, in response to the point made by my honourable friend for Norwich North, who's no longer in her place, that she is right to underline the relationship between education and water and sanitation here. Of course, it's important in terms of children being able to do something as basic as go to the toilet when they're at school, but it's particularly important when it comes to girls' education, because we know that when there's not access to water, it's a particular problem for menstruating girls. So we are using, when it comes to that resilience, Sir Desmond, the UK's strength in artificial intelligence and education technology to make sure that we join this up, that we harness their power responsibly, so that we can support marginalised children, tailor learning to students' needs and boost the capacity of teachers and enable them to reach children who can't join them in the classroom. We're determined to ensure more children can gain the skills they need to make the leap into higher and further education and employment. So once again, many thanks to all of those members who've taken part in this debate. I think it's been an incredibly important one, and I look forward to the closing remarks. Thank you, Sir Desmond.
Chair Lambos, to wind up.
Thank you, Sir Desmond, and it's been a very positive debate that we've had today. It's great that we have cross-party support on this very important issue. I just wish to thank all the members for their contributions and also the Minister for her positive response. Very much look forward to how that investment from the government is going forward and building on the work from the previous governments and their commitment to education. The Minister is obviously a very passionate advocate for education and we very much want to see the fruits of the investment and the steps that the government is taking in education to achieving SDG 4 as soon as possible. Thank you, Sir Desmond.
The question is that this House has considered the International Day of Education. Those that are of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The sitting is suspended until 3 o'clock.